On that note, I think I will introduce our first guest speaker, Neil Denton, who has coordinated Arch for the last 11 years. Since that time, the organisation has grown to become recognised as a model of national good practice for third-party reporting and case management of hate incidents. Arch is also a leader in the field of community tension monitoring and conflict management. In addition to that, coordinating Arch, Neil Denton also chairs the independent advisory group for Newcastle Police and the homophobic and transphobic scrutiny panel for the Crown Prosecution Service North East. He's also a qualified civil and commercial mediator. So could I ask Neil to come forward and start your first presentation, please?
Thank you. Yeah, clap now because you might not at the end. Okay, thank you for your time. I think it's fair to say that in my presentation there will be a couple of images that aren't pleasant, and I'll be using a few words that aren't pleasant. I am only reflecting what is being said at the moment. They are not my words. Thank you. I have a clicker. Abatea rang and said, do you fancy coming and sharing your thoughts on the veil? And I said yes. And then thought back and thought, okay, when was the last time that I really remember an encounter with someone that wore the veil? And I was stood outside the Civic Centre in Newcastle, just on the grassy bit, smoking a tab with a couple of colleagues. And I heard shouting sort of across the edge of the green. And it was a woman that was approaching someone wearing the veil. And you could tell by the body language that the interaction wasn't going to be good. And this woman came up to her, right in front of her, and started swearing at her, called her a terrorist, and said, "Why are you doing that? Take it off. Take it off." At this point, I felt it was sensible that someone else got in between said people, so I did that. My colleague rang the police. The woman was arrested. The woman went to trial, and the woman was convicted of racially aggravated public order offences. Because such things are a crime. It is a crime in this country to cause harassment, alarm, and distress to others. And it's deliberately there, and it's deliberately enshrined in the law in terms of racially aggravated offences, because we know being targeted because of who you are hurts more. It is an attack deep on the core of ourselves. And it leaves victims. I've done a lot of work with victims. Most victims of crime at some point can say, okay, kind of wrong time, wrong place. You don't do that with hate. Because you say, any time, any place, wrong identity. And what I really remember was that. Crying eyes. Since then, I've met the woman again. Her husband is just about to complete a PhD at the university. I use the university coffee shop as a second office, so regularly bump into him. They were happy that justice had been done, but the scars inside still remain. And coming to the town centre is something that becomes really uncomfortable for her. So why? Why and how does it happen? How have we got to this situation? Because they are not isolated incidents. These things happen, and I think these things are getting worse. Well, tonight what I'm here to say is not to let people off the hook for the behaviour I've just described. But what I'm hoping to do is in the next 12 minutes give you a bit of understanding about the psychological processes that explain how any of us can become such perpetrators of hate. Because most journeys that end in hate start with unchangeable and often adaptable cognitive processes, so the way we think. Because as human beings, we sort information. We sort information and we put it into categories based on similarity and difference. And we place value upon those categories. And that can be really handy. So I remember, as a little person, learning that sharp things cut. Hot things burn. Those things are useful. But our problem is that sometimes when we group these things, we do the same with things as we do with people. And when we do that and we place value onto things, we can end up in some pretty strange conclusions about what is good and what is bad. So, there's your brain. If your brain is this number of different colours, come and see me at the end. Things aren't right. But your brain is an amazing bit of kit. I'm a big fan of the human. We're pretty nifty. And there are lots of different ways in which faces become important to us. So information comes in through your eyes, goes down your optic nerve. There's a lateral geniculate nucleus, which is kind of there-ish. That then coalesces in the visual cortex, which is kind of here. But there are actually specific areas of the brain set up specifically for facial recognition. So the fusiform gyrus, for those of you that are testing. And faces mean a lot to us. Our ability to discern faces is the most highly developed visual skill in human beings. Aren't they cute? And they're hardwired. Go on, Sati and Wu, back in 1975, I believe it was, looked at the different hardwiring areas of our brain that track faces. So, from 9 minutes old, a baby will track a face more than any other object. It's what's known as the conspec system. It's only in place for 2 months. Then another system takes over. It's called the concern system. And that becomes more sophisticated. So actually at that point, babies will then track faces only when the features are in the correct positions. So we develop an attentional bias to faces. And why is that important in terms of what we're talking about tonight? Because the impact of faces and being observed and being watched changes our behaviour. Bateson and Nettle over at Newcastle Uni did a study around the impact of being watched and behaviour. They put up signs next to the bike rack. It's still there. It's up by the Robertson Library if you want to go and see psychology in action. Over 2 years, discovered that actually cycle thefts went down by 62% from that rank. It's more effective than CCTV in that study. But I think it's something more than that. I think there's something very specific about eyes out of context with other types of face, and I shall go on to that. Paxby, Hoffman and Gabini, 2000, actually said if you look across the brain, we process facial information in lots of different ways. And we have a series of different functions that we attach to it. Invariant functions. So we use faces to identify each other. But it goes bigger than that. Because in terms of variant information, so faces and the features that change, we read each other in terms of emotion. And we're incredibly sophisticated beings. Most human beings are very, very good at reading the emotions of others. And if you want the psychology behind it, what we call mirror neurons. So a similar pattern of things in your brain fire as if you're actually in that situation. And they're actually distributed across the right and the left hemisphere. For example, right hemisphere is kind of more involved in processing negative perceptions and emotions, left hemisphere for positive. So if you're going up and wanting to be really nice to somebody and make that message stick, come at them from the right. If you're up for a Barney, come in from the left. Just imprints more. Face is also linked to psychological health. So Susslow and Junghans, 2001, did a study of facial perception for people with depression. Seal. And discovered actually people with depression take longer to process positive faces than people without. And it's so important it's subconscious. So Dimberg, Thunberg, and others looked at electromyographic reactions. So we have muscles in our face that respond in terms of how we make an expression and mirror an emotion. When subjects were given images of faces and they were shown quicker than actually they could consciously perceive them, there was still a reaction in terms of the faces. So, where are we? From a psychological perspective, faces are important. Faces are important in terms of identity and identifying each other. Faces are important in terms of empathy. And faces are important in terms of communication. So for a sense of disquiet that might sit there about the veil, there is some psychology to say, yeah, okay, there was an implication of taking away facial recognition from communication. But that does not explain what I saw outside the Civic. For that, you need to do something very specific. Now, I warn you, becoming a wanton perpetrator of hate has psychological implications. So being bad to other humans can do you no good. If you choose to be a perpetrator of hate, it is useful to go through a series of psychological processes to protect yourself. More importantly, though, if there were those of you, when I first told my story about standing outside the Civic and seeing the woman being attacked, for those of you that thought that would never be me, listen up, because that makes you more vulnerable. Zimbardo looked at the Holocaust, he looked at other atrocities and genocides around the world, and he just said, how? How do we get to a point where we can justifiably see another person and think legitimately we may cause them harm, we can take them off the planet? And he said you need to make them less than human. So dehumanization is one of the central processes in the transformation of ordinary, normal, into indifferent or even wanton perpetrators of evil. He calls it a cortical cataract, so something that clouds our thinking, that grows over our ability to perceive each other in real ways. 2 minutes. Okay. And that's really important. He did studies that said, what's the propaganda? So what are the stages you need to go through to turn a human being into a legitimate victim of persecution and hate? These are all 1880 through to about 1950. So he said, you need to name the face of the enemy. Yeah, I think we're doing that in UK society. He said you need to talk about the enemy as the enemy of God. said you need to talk about the enemy as the beast, as the evil creature. And this is 10 minutes on Google, on images. Doesn't take long to find this, folks. It says you need to talk about the enemy as greedy, as the taker of resource. And again, thinking psychology is clever. This is about resource. That's the face of the enemy. And this one. You need to talk about the enemy as the rapist, the desecrator of women, the abuser of children. That was originally used in the First World War in terms of propaganda against the Germans, but obviously with different words. And one of my personal favourites, well done to the male, a strict Muslim raped 4 women. A little bit of a problem there, methinks. And it goes deep. These messages imprint in what we call our limbic system, which is kind of the strong emotion zone in your brain. And it helps us to create a single story about the other, where we talk about people and not to them, where we dehumanize, and it leads us to danger. So what am I saying? I'm saying we have a choice. We can either look at each other as if we're separate species, with horror, with fear, with avoidance, or we can acknowledge, when we talk about the veil, that there is something psychological that suggests that we need to understand how it affects communication between us. That there might be something about the veil that causes a sense of disquiet and suspicion. And therefore it's really important that we walk around the other side of the lens and we attempt to understand each other from the other's point of view and not just from our own perspective. That we do so in a way that peacefully looks at barriers and tries to overcome them. And in a way where leaders help facilitate the space for such debates and discussions. Thank you.